Hello there, and welcome to this unusually calming yet perhaps unsettling deep dive into one of history's least enviable professions, the life of a medieval assassin. Now, when you hear the word assassin, your mind might leap to hooded figures darting along rooftops, slipping past guards with silent precision, dispatching their targets with a whisper of steel before melting back into the night. It's a picture painted by countless novels, video games, and films. But like many things in history, the Hollywood version and the reality are two very different creatures. The truth is that being an assassin in the medieval world was far more terrifying, grueling, and miserable than many of us might imagine. It was not a glamorous calling. It was dirty, dangerous, and often tragically short-lived. To understand why, we need to step back for a moment and set the stage. The medieval world was a place of ceaseless rivalries and blood feuds. Kings clashed with other monarchs. Dukes and barons plotted against rivals. Religious authorities vied for earthly influence while royal houses warred over crowns. Into this swirling cauldron of conflict emerged the shadowy figure of the hired killer, the secret blade in the service of princes and powers who did not want blood on their own hands. These assassins were more often pawns than masterminds, tools put to work in schemes of far larger men. The most infamous association of the word assassin historically is with the Nizari Ismailis, a sect of Shia Islam in the 11th and 12th centuries, based largely in Persia and Syria, often branded by their enemies as the Hashashin. Whether or not they actually consumed hashish in preparation for killings is doubtful, likely an exaggeration peddled by foes, but the name stuck. These were followers of Hassan-i-Sabah, who established a series of mountain fortresses, most famously Alamut. His followers became legendary for their willingness to kill crucial political and military figures with chilling precision and fanatical resolve. Western chroniclers who encountered them during the Crusades shivered at the stories. Robed men who would infiltrate enemy camps, watch patiently for days or even months, and then strike terrifyingly at leaders who thought themselves untouchable. But as you drift with me into this tale, let's dispel one myth. These assassins were not endlessly free spirits leaping across minarets. They were captives of circumstance. Recruitment often came not from romance or adventure, but necessity. Many of the young men who ended up in the Nizari fold had grown up in villages devastated by warfare, drought, or conquest. The mountain fortresses offered safety, food, community, and the powerful allure of belonging to something believed to be divinely sanctioned. From early on, recruits would be indoctrinated with teachings that told them their task was not only justified, but nobly sacred. That to strike down enemies was to secure both divine favor and the survival of their brethren. It was a potent blend of religion, survival, and indoctrination, all of which created an atmosphere where the grim prospects of dying young seemed less horrifying and more inevitable. Still, while outsiders trembled at their bold missions, life for the actual assassins was fraught with difficulty. Training was harsh, physical and mental alike. Recruits had to learn patience above all else, for missions often required weeks or months of waiting, blending in with townsfolk, posing as traders, servants, or guards. They had to memorize escape routes they might never use and become adept in living invisibly in a time when everyone noticed a stranger in town. A young assassin might be placed in a distant city for years, living an ordinary-looking existence while awaiting the signal to act. Imagine a youth who spent his formative years in rugged mountain villages, suddenly transported into crowded bazaars or sprawling cities, and told to simply melt away into anonymity. It carried immense pressure, isolation and misery, an anxiety that gnawed, knowing that at any moment, a life or death command might come. The methods themselves were not thrilling acrobatics. Most assassinations were brutal affairs, plunging daggers into leaders in the middle of crowded meetings, striking in prayer spaces, even infiltrating the personal guards of rulers to get within inches of the target. Once the strike was made, escape was rare. More often than not, the assassins fought until they were cut down or willingly accepted death, believing martyrdom awaited them. Their weapon of choice was often nothing glamorous, just a sturdy dagger, a practical tool designed to ensure silence and certainty. There were no cinematic jumps from rooftops. Simply calculated close combat meant to unsettle entire kingdoms into confusion. But what made this role unbearable for many was not simply the act of killing, grim as that already was, but the oppressive sense of being disposable. In the records left behind, we see over and over how assassins were rarely remembered by name. Their targets became famous. The fortresses of their lords became legendary, but the individual killers disappeared into anonymity. Imagine living, working, training for years, and in the end, sacrificing yourself with all the fervor instilled into you, and then no songs sung, no records kept, no family history preserved. Your name would vanish as if it had never existed beyond whispered orders. Worse still was the psychological torment of prolonged missions. Some assassins infiltrated courts and befriended servants or officials, all under false pretenses, all with the gnawing secret that one day they would have to murder possibly in front of those very acquaintances. The art of patience, while praised by their superiors, could erode the mind. Suspicion hung over every word spoken, every glance exchanged. At any moment, the assassin feared being discovered, tortured, and executed in appallingly public fashion. Records from Sunni rulers show that captured assassins were often paraded and put to death in grotesque ways as a warning to others. To live with this knowledge was to walk daily with death. One has to remember, too, the medieval context in which failure often meant not only your death, but the brutal massacre of communities associated with you. When a Nizari assassin struck successfully, the reprisal might involve entire villages being flattened, thousands killed, or fortresses besieged. For all their small victories, the scale of retaliation kept people around them in constant peril. Thus the assassin bore the unbearable guilt not only of personal survival games, but of consequences that fell upon innocent people in the shadows of political games too vast to grasp. So when we picture the medieval assassin as an enviable, secretive mastermind cloaked in honor, we must temper the vision with the reality that these were young men caught in webs they could not unravel, facing lives of secrecy, paranoia, violence, and almost guaranteed doom. Regardless of their beliefs, the toll was staggering. As the stars rise in your imagination, picture not a robed figure dancing across rooftops, but rather a weary soul, blending into a crowd, clutching a dagger hidden in his cloak, and knowing that his world narrowed to one bloody moment from which there could be no return. In truth, theirs was a life not of freedom but of suffocation. They lived and died in silence, pawns in games beyond their choosing, remembered only through the shuddering tales of those who feared them. This was why, for all the mystery and legend, to actually be one was no glamorous fate at all. It was instead a path straight into loneliness, suspicion, and often a violent end that passed almost unnoticed into history. That is the beginning of our journey into why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. When we left off, we had opened the door to the grim reality of life as a medieval assassin, seeing that the glamour of fiction was far removed from the lonely, dangerous existence these men endured. To deepen our journey, let's step back inside their shadowy world and consider the daily burdens and challenges that made this life such an ordeal. Because assassination was not a profession someone stumbled into out of mere curiosity, it was one rooted in meticulous planning, constant fear, and a crushing sense that every move could be the last. For many assassins, the day did not begin with freedom or choice, but with strict discipline. Imagine rising each morning inside a fortress like Alamut, perched among unforgiving mountain cliffs of Persia. Life there was intensely controlled. You awoke to prayer, instruction in religious doctrine, and daily training. Your body was subject to drills that toughened you for endurance, for you were expected to spend days or even weeks in discomfort without complaint. Fasting, climbing ragged peaks, sparring until exhaustion. These were practices meant to harden recruits. At the same time, your mind was continuously filled with the words of imams and teachers, drilling into you the dual conviction that your mission was sacred and your loyalty unquestionable. Doubt was not tolerated. Hesitation was unthinkable. For those dispatched to live under cover in towns or cities, life became even more suffocating. You were forced to maintain a facade at all times. You sold goods in the marketplace or labored for local masters while hiding your deadly purpose. You smiled politely at neighbors and worshipped beside unsuspecting townsfolk, but every casual interaction was an act. The weight of carrying such concealment could be overwhelming. Any slip of the tongue, unusual gesture, or unexplained absence might arouse suspicion. To live under such pressure was to live without rest, trapped in a performance with death as the cost of failure. And yet, for all the discipline and patience demanded, success was far from guaranteed. The medieval world was one of rumor and paranoia, and information traveled swiftly. Targets often moved with entourages of guards, rarely appearing in public without elaborate security. Sometimes assassins had to wait years only to learn they had been discovered, their missions aborted, and their covers blown. Failure meant the torture chamber more often than the simple mercy of execution. Captured assassins could expect to be interrogated cruelly, their suffering drawn out in hopes of uncovering conspiracies, or at least providing an entertaining spectacle for the public. In many cultures, the death of a captured assassin was staged extravagantly to terrify others. Crucifixion, dismemberment, or being hurled from walls were not uncommon. It's little wonder their training sought to erase all fear of pain and to glorify death as a kind of chosen release. The pay, for those motivated by more earthly matters, was dismal. One might assume that risking your life at the command of powerful leaders would be worth vast sums of gold, but records show this was rarely the case. Payment often took the form of food security, protection for your family, or vague promises of higher status, which cruelly many assassins never lived to reap. At times, the assassination itself was considered payment enough, the reward being an assurance of spiritual salvation. In practice, actual wealth was negligible. Compared to merchants or skilled artisans, the assassin existed at the lowest end of economic security, subsisting in shadow rather than thriving in comfort. Mental burden was perhaps the greatest torment. Histories of the period record assassins behaving in ways that betrayed fragile psychological states, a sharp severity, sudden rages, or eerie detachment from years of carrying impossible weight. It is not hard to imagine why. You lived knowing your family might become a target if you faltered. Your community might burn should things go wrong. And your intended act was not simply murder. It was often regicide, political decapitation, an attempt to collapse entire networks of power. When one blade took a ruler's life, it could ignite wars, massacres, holy conflicts, and retaliations. To be a single individual carrying such pressure was unbearable. There's a curious irony in how the assassins were both feared and pitied. Their enemies described them as devils, creatures without fear, willing to strike at kings and generals alike in the heart of daylight. Yet to their own people they were tragic symbols, heroic perhaps in purpose, but hollowed shells in practice. For although they were celebrated in story as martyrs, their actual lived experience was more akin to being prisoners, bound by oaths, cut off from ordinary life, living in permanent readiness for a command that would likely demand their very existence. We should not forget that assassination, while infamous among the Nizari sect, existed elsewhere in the medieval world too. In Christian Europe, Byzantine politics were notorious for intrigue and sudden deaths. Poison became a favoured weapon in cloistered courts. Wine sweetened with deadly additions, meals flavoured with subtle bitterness. The assassin in this realm was less a hooded infiltrator and more often a courtier, servant, or cook quietly pressed into service. Yet even for them the risks were staggering. If the ruse was discovered, punishments were abominably inventive, ranging from mutilation to burning. And like their Islamic world counterparts, these killers rarely gained the power or riches of those who hired them. They lived small lives, their names erased, remembered only in whispers about mysterious deaths at feasts and weddings. Imagine the sheer terror of walking into a banquet hall carrying poisoned chalices, knowing that if your target recognized the bitterness or simply refused the cup, you would not walk out alive. Every guard's glance became a dagger against you, every servant's stare a potential betrayal. You would stand in the press of bodies, pretending calm while your heart beat like a war drum. And in the end, you almost certainly died regardless of outcome, killed if caught, silenced even if successful. A life spent in fear, with no prospect of escape, prosperity, or even happiness. Layer over this the medieval obsession with sin and salvation. In a period where both Christians and Muslims spoke constantly of heaven and hell, what did it mean to take on the label of murderer? Murder not of enemies in bold battle, but by stealthy personal execution. Even when trained to believe such actions were sanctified, one wonders how many lay awake at night beneath coarse woolen blankets, staring at dark rafters and wondering whether flames or paradise awaited them. For all the repetition of doctrine, faith does not always silence human conscience. How many assassins wrestled with doubt, unable to speak it aloud? How many felt consumed by guilt, yet forced each dawn to continue preparing, to keep smiling at neighbours, while knowing their soul was already poisoned from within? This torment is why perhaps the assassin's life was not envied even among those who admired their courage. They lived so tightly under the thumb of masters, tradition, and circumstance that their humanity often seemed leached away before they had truly lived. They lived in bodies drained of laughter and joy, waiting patiently for the end they had been assigned. The next step in our exploration, then, is to understand not only the mechanics of how assassins lived and acted, but how the world around them perceived them, as inspirations, as monsters, or as tragedies. Their reputation was larger than their lives, a legend far greater than reality, yet also a burden heavier than any mortal should carry. It is there, at the intersection of myth and misery, that the medieval assassin truly becomes one of history's most tragic figures. As our story continues, it becomes clear that the life of a medieval assassin was suffocating, not just because of the dangers inherent in their missions, but because of how they were perceived and used by those in power. Assassins lived in the shadows, yet their reputation blazed across the medieval world like a warning torch in the darkness. The terror they inspired was often grossly out of proportion to their actual numbers or successes, yet this very reputation ensured they would never escape suspicion, never be treated as anything other than dangerous tools or disposable pawns. To rulers who sought to command them, assassins were a kind of living weapon, silent blades rather than swords forged of iron. This made them both valuable and terrifying to those who commissioned killings. Leaders wanted their services but did not trust their presence. Imagine being summoned by a noble or a military commander, promised favor and protection, yet also closely watched for the slightest sign of betrayal. The assassin could never rest easy, not even among supposed allies, because loyalty in this dark trade was as flimsy as parchment in the rain. The very men who begged you to eliminate rivals might be plotting how best to dispose of you next. This uneasy relationship between killers and their patrons meant assassins walked a perilously thin line. If successful, their employers often distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with dishonorable deeds. The assassin would be praised with whispered gratitude on one day and abandoned to an enemy's justice the next. If they failed, they bore the entire weight of failure alone, their masters conveniently silent about the orders they'd given. This loneliness amplified the sense that assassins were little more than shadows in human form, never allowed to bask in victory, never forgiven for mistakes. The broader world certainly did not see them as heroes. Villagers whispered of assassins as if they were demons wearing human flesh, dangerous men who could appear anywhere at any time. Crusaders told chilling stories of comrades who fell in broad daylight to sudden knife thrusts, their killers vanishing into crowds or dying on the spot. This contributed to a perception of assassins as almost supernatural. European chroniclers often exaggerated tales of their fanaticism, spreading the story that drug rituals prepared them for death, that they were half-mad zealots rushing into swords without fear. While much of this was propaganda meant to cast them as monstrous, the stories stuck, building into a legend darker than the truth, but one which left the actual men doomed to a legacy they could never control. That very legend sparked paranoia across societies. In courts and castles, rulers distrusted unfamiliar faces, always suspecting assassins lurked nearby. Guards might be doubled, food tasters tested each dish, and even loyal attendants faced suspicion. The presence of just the idea of assassins poisoned the air with fear. Yet while leaders braced against shadows, the very assassins who sparked this terror faced wretched conditions. They had none of the glory attached to traditional soldiers who fought under banners, who were given feasts and rewards after campaigns. Instead, the assassin moved invisibly, his achievements whispered but never sung aloud, his death bringing only silence. Even within the circles that trained and commanded them, not every assassin was treated equally. Senior men might be honored with tasks of infiltration and long preparation, but younger recruits were sometimes sent deliberately on suicidal missions to demonstrate their obedience. To be young and expendable meant being dispatched on tasks where survival was not expected. You struck publicly, were cut down immediately, all to send a message to enemies that resistance or defiance would be met with blood. Imagine being given only a dagger and a simple command to rush an enemy leader in the open, and doing so because refusal was unthinkable and philosophy had promised eternal reward for obedience. For the assassin, even death became part of duty. Perhaps one of the darkest aspects of their profession was what awaited them if captured alive. Medieval rulers understood that assassins carried secrets, and those secrets were thought worth prying loose at any cost. When unlucky assassins were seized, they faced not swift justice but drawn-out torment. Chroniclers describe men stretched on racks until their joints shattered, branded with iron, or mutilated as bystanders jeered. These executions were not simply punishment, but theatre, designed to show that anyone daring to live as a shadow killer would die in public agony. And so, while death in battle might be almost merciful for knights and soldiers, for assassins, there was almost no such mercy. Beyond the sword and the dagger, poisons occupied a particularly notorious role. In medieval Europe and Byzantium, the cupbearer assassin was one of the most feared spectres. Meals, wines, and even church chalices became suspect. Unlike in open murder, poison left little sign at first, but once discovered it unleashed a violent backlash. Those accused of poisoning faced especially cruel ends, often burned alive or boiled in order to make an example. This made the poisoned assassin perhaps even more despised than the dagger wielder. Kings and bishops considered poisoning unnatural, an evil act that warped the fabric of society. Even to one's allies, involvement in such dark arts made one dangerous. And yet, those who agreed to these tasks knew that if they tried to leave the trade, they carried too much knowledge to be allowed to live freely. Once tangled in shadowy work, there was no easy escape. Interestingly, the anxiety assassins inspired left fingerprints on culture itself. In Europe, rulers built inner chambers within chambers, designing their castles with layers of walls and tiny windows to prevent intrusions. In the Islamic world, governors hired double guards to sleep across their chamber doors, sleeping almost on the thresholds themselves. Even ceremonial greetings changed. Nobles often demanded that visitors approach unarmed and embrace them publicly, a way to verify no dagger was hidden. The legend of assassins shaped architecture, rituals, even everyday etiquette. Yet while their shadows spread widely, the assassins themselves were often miserable, isolated souls, unwelcome in guilds, distrusted by towns, and unrecognized for their sacrifices. So when we consider why their lives were so dreadful, it is not enough to point to the danger of their missions alone. They carried the burden of being universally hated even by those who employed them. They wielded no real honor, carried no banners, and earned no songs. Instead, they faced the hatred of enemies, the suspicion of employers, and the terror of ordinary people. In life they were pariahs. In death they were forgotten. What glory can come from a life where the only legacy you leave is fear, and the only certainty is suffering? And yet they endured, because survival, indoctrination, and the hope of redemption, whether divine or through small promises made by their keepers, kept them bound tight to this path. Their misery can only be fully understood by recognizing that they were trapped not just by circumstance, but by an entire system built to ensure they could never leave. Their loyalty was sealed not with contracts of gold, but with ideology, fear, and the force of exile from any other kind of life. This tragic paradox, that assassins could terrify kings but were powerless in their own existence, brings us closer to understanding their world. What we have yet to explore is how these shadows of history, despite their wretched lives, left behind a legend that would spread for centuries and inspire imaginations long after their bones had turned to dust. As we come to the final steps of our journey, it's time to look at the long shadow these assassins left behind, and why, despite the grim misery of their existence, they became some of the most enduring figures in world history. Their reality, as we have seen, was one of suffocating secrecy, short lifespans, betrayal, and often torturous deaths. And yet, legends would eventually grow and stretch across centuries, transforming them from tragic pawns into almost mythical beings. The irony, of course, is that this transformation has little to do with who they actually were, and far more to do with how fearful and fascinated the world became with the idea of them. The legend of the Nizari Ismaili assassins, with their mountaintop fortresses and their eerie willingness to die for their cause, spread like wildfire across the medieval world. Crusaders whispered of them in dread. Chroniclers recorded their feats with horrified fascination, and stories grew taller with every retelling. Tales of young men intoxicated in heavenly gardens before being dispatched to kill, of silent killers who could slip through walls and past guards, became staples of lore. Whether or not these stories were true did not matter. The myth was far more powerful than the reality. It was the myth that made rulers quake and sleep uneasily at night, imagining unseen blades circling ever closer. The individual assassin's life was one of misery, but taken together, their collective reputation reshaped politics and culture, a silent weapon more potent than armies. But this fear which elevated their legend, also magnified their suffering. In medieval society, where reputation was currency, being reduced to a symbol meant losing humanity. They were not seen as men with families, doubts, or need for rest. They became bogeymen, embodiments of pure threat, and in time this made their lives even harder. No one wanted to interact with them except as tools. No one wanted to remember their names except as warnings. The true assassin was trapped between reality and legend, consumed in life yet exalted in story after death. The long aftermath of their existence is revealing. In Europe, the very word assassin entered language not merely as a title, but as a concept, an idea so steeped in dread that centuries later it remains synonymous with stealth and murder. In literature and folklore, their deeds became magnified into near mystical performances, paving the way for romanticized visions far removed from their historical reality. Early modern writers and then popular culture in our own age expanded the myth further, painting assassins as rebels, freedom seekers, or noble warriors. This may entertain us, but it also veils the truth, that most assassins were cut down before their lives had truly begun, unremembered, carrying only the burden of obedience. In some respects, the suffering of assassins was not unique. Countless medieval professions were harsh. Peasants lived in backbreaking conditions. Soldiers perished anonymously in bloody fields. Monks surrendered worldly joys for monastic labor. Yet the assassin's lot carried a particularly bitter note, because unlike others, their lives were given to duties pursued in silence, shunned even by those who benefited from them. For all their impact on history, they were stripped of glory, companionship, and peace of mind. And in many ways, that is why it truly sucked to be an assassin in the medieval world. Because you were asked to bear the responsibilities of kings while being treated as less than the lowest servant, forced into misery that never gave way to gratitude, and yet, from these miserable lives, their shadows stretched into eternity. The memory of assassins influenced how castles were built, how rulers dined, how guards were chosen, how paranoia became etched into the very fabric of leadership. Perhaps their greatest legacy was not the deaths they caused, but the fear they sustained. They made men look over their shoulders, check their goblets twice, mistrust servants, and build barricades even within chambers of stone. Kings, who claimed to be unshakable, were suddenly reminded of their fragility because of men who lived in hiding and died quickly, forgotten. There is a strangely bittersweet lesson in all of this. The assassin was trained to think his life had ultimate purpose, his death carrying divine weight, his act altering the worlds of nations. And yet, in the broader sweep of time, his life was rarely celebrated. He lived miserably, died violently, and yet centuries later, his profession became romanticized in folk tales, novels, plays, and eventually, in the last few decades, sprawling entertainment franchises that turned them into impossibly agile heroes. What the real assassins might think of such portrayals is unknowable, but perhaps one could imagine a weary grin. After all, though their bones long ago turned to dust, the world still whispers their name. So why does this matter as we lull ourselves into reflection? Perhaps because behind every great myth or legend lies a truth that is far less glamorous, yet more human. Behind the mask of the assassin was not a hero of the rooftops, but a frightened, indoctrinated man, bound by duty, crushed by fear, starved of freedom. His was not a story of triumph, but of burden, of anonymity, of endless waiting, of grim endings in alleys, courts, and marketplaces. It teaches us that sometimes the stories we inherit are born not from glory, but from the pain of forgotten lives. And so, as we gently lower the curtain on this tale, let us remember that the assassins, however grim their profession, were still human beings caught in systems and ideologies much larger than themselves. They were men whose lives were spent under shadows where no sunlight shone, who suffered so that others could cling closer to power or victory. Legends have turned them into symbols, but the truth, whispered quietly as you drift towards sleep, is that theirs was a life of secrecy and sorrow, bound always toward a violent end. Their story remains compelling not because it was enviable, but because it reveals the cruel, fragile nature of power itself. The assassin stood where the dreams of kings and the mortality of man met, a grim reminder that even the mightiest could fall to a hidden blade, and that those blades were wielded by men who knew, better than anyone else, that their own lives would count for nothing in the end. Perhaps that is why, despite the centuries, we still tell their stories. Not out of envy, but out of haunted fascination. A reminder of how human ambition, belief, and fear can condemn ordinary souls into the role of shadows who existed only to vanish. And now, with their story told in full, may their restless shadows fade at last into silence. We've now followed the assassin from his recruitment through his daily reality, his missions, the fear he inspired in the mighty, the misery he suffered in life, and the disturbing legacy that outlived him. To close this journey, let's step back and take in the full picture of why, in the medieval world, it truly was a fate to dread rather than a path to glory. The central tragedy of the assassin's life lay in its contradiction. On one hand, he was surrounded by a mystique of fear. Kings, generals, and bishops lost sleep at the thought of him. His very name travelled ahead of him, casting shadows on banquet halls and fortresses across continents. But on the other hand, he himself had almost no real power, no voice, no autonomy. He was not shaping kingdoms, but being used by them. His blade may have struck down rulers, but the hand that guided that blade never steered history. It merely executed plans made higher up the chain. His existence was framed as important, but his individuality didn't matter. He was both feared and forgotten, a figure both mighty in reputation, but utterly miserable in reality. That paradox kept him bound, with little chance of escaping his fate. Consider also the sheer toll of living in permanent suspicion. An assassin had no home life waiting for him, no chance to grow old selling goods at market, watching seasons change peacefully, raising children to adulthood. All those ordinary human joys were impossible in the life he was given. Everything revolved around secrecy and death. If he survived his missions, he could never truly trust anyone, never reveal his past, never let his guard fall. He became a ghost while still alive, a wanderer for whom normal human ties were impossible. That loneliness is perhaps even more awful than the moment of dying with a dagger in hand. The psychological burden of knowing death could arrive suddenly at every corner was enormous. Unlike a soldier who could fight proudly with comrades beside him, the assassin fought alone, and his enemies were not merely enemies but heads of state, military leaders, or lords whose very positions meant hundreds of guards might try to cut him down. He carried with him the endless weight of being told that his duty justified everything, and yet he also knew that others would not care about his name once he was gone. Imagine the wrenching awareness that your task might alter the future, but you yourself would never be remembered as more than a nameless shadow. One can see, too, how their lives were built upon layers of coercion. Recruitment drew on desperation. Poverty, orphanhood, political instability, or coercion through ideology. They were promised paradise or honor in death, rewards that conveniently pushed focus away from the pain of their present lives. Once initiated, leaving became impossible. With secrets woven into their very training, their masters could never let them walk freely out of the shadows. Loyalty was not just demanded, but enforced by circumstance. Leaving was a death sentence. Obedience was required, and hesitation was unthinkable. That heavy cage left them with no paths forward except through blood. And yet, despite everything, their story is still with us. Perhaps that is the strangest twist of all. Most laborers and soldiers of the medieval world slipped quietly into time's oblivion, forgotten by name. But the assassin, the most faceless of all, became immortal in memory. Their great misery became our fascination. Their grim anonymity became a legend spun into countless tales. In truth, the immortal assassin is less about the men themselves than about the fear they produced. A shadow passed along in rumor, and that reflection forces us to ask, how many ordinary men lived and perished miserably so that their myth could terrify generations who never knew them? There's a certain justice in remembering this, not to celebrate their profession, but to give weight to the reality of their suffering. A legend without the truth behind it is incomplete, and the truth here is both sobering and revealing. For all their deadly reputation, the assassin's life was not enviable but pitiable. A fate of secrecy, indoctrination, loneliness, suspicion, and violent ends. It shows us how myths are built from human misery, how shadows become symbols, and how easy it is to retell stories in ways that erase the people at their core. And so, as we draw this long and winding path to its end, perhaps the final lesson we can take from these medieval assassins is a simple one: that power often devours those who serve it, and history too easily glorifies what should caution us instead. In their world, kings needed shadows, rulers needed daggers, and religions sought instruments of fear. But behind it all were ordinary men, poor, desperate, indoctrinated, whose entire lives were consumed for causes they would never live to enjoy. Their story sits at the intersection of terror and tragedy, where human ambition robs men of humanity itself. That is why, beyond the tales of gardens, fortresses, and fanatical loyalty, the only honest conclusion about their lives is this: it truly, absolutely sucked to be a medieval assassin. And with that understanding, their shadows return to silence. Perhaps now, finally, they can rest, not as heroes, not as monsters, but as men whose suffering built legends far larger than themselves,